The bullet missed Garrett Ellis by inches, shattering the whiskey bottle behind her head and sending shards of glass cascading across the rough wooden floor of the Bodie saloon. She did not flinch. Her green eyes remained fixed on the man across the room, the one whose hand still hovered near his holster, the one she had despised with every fiber of her being for the past 6 years. Thomas Sullivan stood there with that infuriating expression of his, half anger and half something she refused to name, his jaw clenched tight beneath the shadow of his black hat. It was April 1878, and the mining town of Bodie, California, thrummed with the chaos of newfound wealth and desperate men. Garrett had arrived here as a girl of 14 with her father, back when the town was nothing but a handful of buildings and impossible dreams. Now, at 22, she ran the general store her father had built from nothing, the store that Thomas Sullivan's family had tried to buy out 3 times in the past 2 years. The store that sat on land that Thomas claimed his father had a legal right to, though Garrett knew the documents he waved around were forgeries as sure as she knew her own name. "You need to learn to control your men, Sullivan," Garrett said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence of the saloon. The drunk cowhand who had fired the shot stumbled backward, mumbling apologies, but Garrett kept her gaze locked on Thomas. "Or maybe you just hire anyone foolish enough to work for a family of cheats and liars." Thomas's eyes darkened, and he stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. At 24, he was broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and a face that might have been handsome if it were not always twisted in frustration whenever he looked at her. "My men wouldn't be in here drinking if your store hadn't just undercut our prices on supplies again. You are trying to run us out of business, Garrett. Your business is built on stolen land and broken promises," Garrett shot back. She was aware of the other patrons watching them, the miners and drifters who had seen this same argument play out 100 times before. Everyone in Bodie knew about the feud between the Ellis and Sullivan families. It had started before Garrett could even remember why. Something about a mining claim and a partnership gone wrong, and it had festered like an infected wound ever since. Thomas took another step closer, and Garrett could smell leather and pine and something distinctly him. "My father founded his ranch before your father even thought about opening that store. We have rights to that water access, and you know it. The only thing I know is that your father was a drunk who gambled away whatever rights he might have had," Garrett said, and she saw Thomas's hand curl into a fist. For a moment, she thought he might actually hit her, but instead he turned sharply and grabbed his cowhand by the collar, dragging him toward the door. "Stay away from my family, Garrett," Thomas said over his shoulder, his voice low and dangerous. "One of these days you are going to push too far." She watched him leave, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and something else she refused to acknowledge. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, set a new bottle of whiskey on the counter and shook his head. "You two are going to kill each other one of these days." "Not if he stays on his side of town," Garrett muttered, but her hands were shaking as she left the saloon and stepped out into the dusty street. Bodie spread out before her in all its chaotic glory. Buildings lined the main street, some barely more than tents with wooden frames, others solid structures that promised permanence. The town had exploded in population over the past year as word of the gold strike spread, and now nearly 10,000 souls called this place home. Garrett walked quickly, nodding to familiar faces, until she reached her store at the corner of Main and Green streets. The building was solid, 2 stories of good timber with glass windows that her father had hauled all the way from Sacramento. Inside, Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from flour and coffee to mining equipment and bolts of fabric. Her assistant, a young Chinese man named Y, looked up from where he was organizing canned goods. "Miss Ellis, are you all right? I heard there was trouble at the saloon." "Nothing I could not handle," Garrett said, though she moved to the back room and sank into her father's old chair. The office smelled of leather and tobacco, remnants of the man who had built this place and died 2 years ago, leaving everything to his only daughter. Some people in town thought she should sell and move back east, find a husband and live a proper life. But Garrett had no intention of abandoning what her father had worked so hard to create, especially not to the Sullivan family. She spent the rest of the afternoon going over ledgers and inventory, trying to push thoughts of Thomas Sullivan from her mind. It was not the first time they had nearly come to blows, and it would not be the last. Their families had been at war for so long that hatred felt like second nature, as familiar and constant as the dust that blew through Bodie's streets. As evening settled over the town, Garrett locked up the store and walked to the small house she kept behind the building. It was modest but comfortable, with an iron stove and a real bed frame and curtains her mother had sewn before consumption took her 5 years back. Garrett heated water for tea and stood at the window, watching the sun set behind the Sierra Nevada mountains in the distance. She did not hear the first howls. They came later, deep in the night when most of Bodie was either asleep or still drinking away their earnings. Garrett woke to the sound of her neighbor's dog barking frantically, and then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Wolves. Not the distant lonely howl of a single animal, but a chorus of them, close and getting closer. She lit a lamp and pulled on her boots, grabbing the rifle her father had taught her to shoot when she was 10. Outside, she could hear shouts and the sound of horses screaming in panic. Garrett ran into the street and saw chaos. A pack of wolves, at least a dozen of them, had descended on the town's eastern edge where several families kept livestock. But these were not ordinary wolves. They were massive, their eyes reflecting the lamplight with an eerie intelligence, and they moved with coordinated purpose that spoke of hunger beyond anything natural. "Get the animals inside," someone shouted, and Garrett saw her neighbors scrambling to protect their horses and milk cows. She raised her rifle and fired at a wolf that was stalking toward Mrs. Chen's chicken coop, but the animal barely flinched, turning to look at her with those unsettling eyes before loping away into the darkness. More shots rang out across town, and Garrett heard men organizing, trying to drive the pack away. She was reloading when she saw movement in her peripheral vision. A wolf, larger than the others, had circled around and was now between her and her house. It lowered its head, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed too long, too sharp. Garrett brought her rifle up, but her hands were shaking. She had hunted rabbits and deer, had shot at targets and tin cans, but she had never had a predator look at her like this, like she was meat and nothing more. The wolf tensed, preparing to spring, and Garrett knew her single shot might not be enough. The gunshot came from her left, loud and close, and the wolf yelped and stumbled. Another shot followed, and the animal turned and fled into the night. Garrett spun to see Thomas Sullivan standing there, his rifle still raised, his face grim in the lamplight. "You should get inside," he said, not looking at her. "I can handle myself," Garrett replied automatically, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Sure you can," Thomas said, and this time he did look at her, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite the hatred she was used to. "But these wolves are not normal. They have been hitting ranches up in the hills for 2 weeks now. Killed 30 head of cattle on the Morrison place. My father sent me and the hands into town tonight because we heard they were moving this way." Garrett wanted to argue, to tell him she did not need his help or his information, but another howl cut through the air, closer this time, and she saw more wolves slinking between buildings. Thomas grabbed her arm, his hand warm and solid, and pulled her toward the general store. "We need to get everyone into the larger buildings," he said. "The wolves are smart enough to test doors. We need solid walls and multiple shooters." Garrett hated that he was right, but she nodded and ran with him toward the store. Y was already there, having heard the commotion, and he helped them start barricading the door. Other townspeople began arriving, families with children, elderly folks who could not defend themselves, even some of the miners who lived in tents and had no protection at all. Within an hour, nearly 50 people had crowded into the general store, and Garrett could hear similar gatherings happening at the saloon and the church. Thomas had organized the men who could shoot, positioning them at windows while Garrett distributed ammunition from her stock. They worked side by side in tense silence, their usual animosity temporarily forgotten in the face of a greater threat. "How many are out there?" Garrett asked as she handed Thomas a box of cartridges. "Hard to say. At least 20, maybe more." Thomas loaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. "The strange thing is, wolves do not usually hunt like this. They do not attack towns. Something has driven them down from the mountains. Maybe the mining has disrupted their territory," Garrett suggested, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. She could see shapes moving between buildings, hear the scratch of claws on wood. "Maybe," Thomas said, but he sounded doubtful. "Or maybe they are just starving. It was a hard winter in the high country." For several hours they waited in the dim lamplight, listening to the wolves prowl outside. Occasionally, one would test a door or window and shots would ring out, driving them back. The children huddled with their mothers in the back room, and the old men told stories to keep spirits up, but Garrett could feel the fear in the air, thick and choking. She found herself standing near Thomas more often than not, both of them watching the street through the front window. In all the years she had hated him, she had never really looked at him, not like this. She noticed the scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw clenched when he was concentrating, the careful way he checked and rechecked his rifle to make sure it would not jam. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for earlier, when that wolf had me cornered." Thomas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You would have done the same." "I do not know if I would have," Garrett admitted, "given everything between our families." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the street. "The feud is stupid," he said finally. "It has always been stupid. But my father would not let it go, and your father would not either. And now here we are, two people who barely know each other but hate each other anyway because we are supposed to." Garrett felt something shift in her chest, some long-held certainty cracking. "Your father tried to steal our land. Your father accused mine of cheating at cards and got him banned from half the establishments in town," Thomas countered, but his voice lacked heat. "And maybe they both had their reasons, and maybe they were both wrong about some things. All I know is I am tired of fighting over things that happened before I was old enough to understand them." Before Garrett could respond, a scream cut through the night. One of the wolves had broken through the back door of the dry goods store across the street, and people were pouring out into the open, fleeing toward the saloon. Thomas did not hesitate. He kicked open the door of the general store and ran out, firing at the wolves that immediately turned toward the fleeing townspeople. Garrett followed without thinking, her rifle raised. Together, they provided covering fire while men, women, and children ran for safety. A wolf lunged at Thomas from the side, and Garrett shot it before it could reach him. Thomas turned and shot another that had circled behind Garrett. They moved in sync, backs to each other, firing and reloading and firing again until the street was clear and the wolves had retreated once more. Back inside the store, breathing hard, they stared at each other. Thomas had a scratch on his cheek from a splinter of wood, and Garrett's hands were blackened with gunpowder. "We make a decent team," Thomas said, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Do not get used to it," Garrett replied, but there was no real venom in her words. The wolves finally retreated as dawn broke over Bodie, leaving behind a town shaken but largely intact. 3 people had been injured but none killed, and only a handful of livestock had been lost. As the sun rose and people began to emerge from their shelters, Garrett stood in the doorway of her store and watched Thomas gather his men. He caught her eye from across the street and tipped his hat, a small gesture that somehow meant more than all the arguments they had ever had. Then he mounted his horse and rode out toward the Sullivan ranch, leaving Garrett standing there with questions she had never thought to ask before. The next few days passed in a strange new tension. The wolves did not return, but the memory of them hung over Bodie like a storm cloud. Garrett found herself thinking about Thomas at odd moments, remembering the way he had moved during the attack, the way he had organized the defense without hesitation, the way his hand had felt on her arm when he pulled her to safety. She told herself it meant nothing. One night of cooperation did not erase 6 years of bitter rivalry. But when Thomas came into her store 3 days later, she found her heart beating faster, and she hated herself for it. "I need supplies," he said without preamble. "Fencing wire and nails." "The wolves got into our northern pasture last night. They are still out there." Garrett nodded and began gathering what he needed, acutely aware of his presence in her store. "How much damage?" "Lost 6 calves and a bull." Thomas's voice was tight with frustration. "We have men riding patrol every night, but the pack is too big. They hit one section while we are watching another." "The same thing is happening to the other ranches," Garrett said. She had heard the stories from her customers. The Morrison family had lost even more livestock, and the Henderson place had been hit twice in 1 week. Thomas paid for his supplies, but he lingered at the counter. "There is talk of organizing a hunting party, tracking the wolves back to their den and dealing with them permanently." "That sounds dangerous," Garrett said before she could stop herself. "It is necessary," Thomas replied. He met her eyes and she saw exhaustion there and something else. "But I wanted you to know, in case anything happens." "Why would I care what happens to you?" Garrett asked, but the question came out softer than she intended. Thomas smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his face. "I do not know, but I think maybe you do." He left before she could form a response, and Garrett stood there feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The hunting party assembled 2 days later. 20 men, all experienced riders and shooters, gathered at dawn with the intention of tracking the wolf pack into the mountains. Thomas was among them, and so was his younger brother, a boy of 19 named Daniel. Garrett watched them prepare from the window of her store, her stomach tight with worry she had no right to feel. She was not the only one concerned. The whole town turned out to see them off, wives kissing husbands, mothers clinging to sons. Mrs. Sullivan, Thomas's mother, stood with her hand on her youngest boy's shoulder, her face pale but composed. She was a hard woman, made harder by years of fighting with Garrett's father, but in that moment, Garrett saw only a mother afraid of losing her children. On impulse, Garrett left her store and walked to where Thomas was checking his saddle. He looked up in surprise as she approached. "Be careful," she said simply. Thomas studied her face. "I will. I mean it," Garrett insisted. "These wolves are not natural. There is something wrong with them." "I know," Thomas said. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it. "But we cannot let them keep killing our livestock. The ranches cannot sustain losses like this." "I understand," Garrett said. "Just come back." Something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Then Thomas mounted his horse and rode out with the others, and Garrett stood in the street watching until they disappeared into the foothills. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Garrett tried to work, tried to focus on inventory and customers, but her mind kept drifting to the mountains and the men riding into danger. By evening, she found herself pacing her small house, unable to eat or rest. When the first rider came galloping back into town just after midnight, Garrett was still awake. She threw on her coat and ran into the street, joining the crowd that had gathered around the exhausted man. It was Daniel Sullivan, and even in the dim light of the torches, Garrett could see the blood on his shirt. "Wolves," Daniel gasped, sliding from his horse. "Dozens of them. They ambushed us in a canyon. We killed some, but they separated us. Thomas and 6 others are still out there, pinned down. We need help." Garrett did not think. She ran back to her house, grabbed her rifle and ammunition, and saddled her own horse, a sturdy mare named Copper. By the time she returned to the street, men were organizing another party to ride out, but Garrett did not wait. She kicked Copper into a gallop and headed for the mountains, following the trail Daniel had described. Behind her, she heard someone shouting her name, but she did not stop. All she could think about was Thomas, surrounded by wolves, maybe injured, maybe dying. The hatred she had carried for so long had burned away, leaving behind something raw and urgent that she was finally ready to name. The canyon was not hard to find. Garrett heard the gunshots long before she saw the flickering light of a campfire in the distance. She rode hard, urging Copper up the rocky trail, until she reached a narrow passage between high stone walls. There, in a small clearing, 7 men had their backs to a cliff face, firing at shapes that moved in the darkness beyond their fire's light. Thomas saw her coming and his eyes went wide. "Garrett, get back!" But Garrett was already off her horse, rifle raised. She took position at the edge of their defensive circle and began firing at the wolves. Up close, in the firelight, they were even more terrifying than she remembered. Their fur was matted and their ribs showed, but their eyes gleamed with fierce intelligence. More riders arrived behind Garrett, the men from town who had followed her, and suddenly the odds shifted. With fresh ammunition and more guns, they began to drive the wolves back. But the pack's alpha, a massive gray beast with scarred flanks, refused to retreat. It circled the camp, looking for weaknesses, and when it spotted one of the younger cowboys reloading, it charged. Thomas threw himself in the wolf's path, firing point blank, but the animal was too close, too fast. It barreled into him, knocking him to the ground, and Garrett heard herself scream. She ran forward, firing wildly, and felt the rifle's recoil jar through her shoulders. The wolf yelped and turned toward her, blood streaming from its shoulder. For a heartbeat, Garrett stood frozen as the creature gathered itself to spring. Then Thomas was there, shoving her aside and emptying his revolver into the wolf's chest. The animal collapsed, twitching, and finally went still. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by harsh breathing and the crackle of the fire. The rest of the pack had fled, disappearing into the night like ghosts. Thomas was still on the ground, and Garrett dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, her hands running over his arms and chest, checking for wounds. "I am fine," Thomas said, catching her hands. "Garrett, what were you thinking, riding out here alone?" "I was thinking you might die," Garrett said, and her voice broke. "I was thinking I could not stand it if you did." Thomas stared at her, and in the firelight she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "Garrett." "I know," she said. "I know we are supposed to hate each other. I know our families have been at war forever, but I do not hate you, Thomas. I do not think I ever really did." Thomas pulled her close, and Garrett went willingly, burying her face against his chest. He smelled of sweat and gunpowder and pine, and his arms around her felt like the safest place in the world. "I do not hate you either," he said quietly. "I think I have been trying not to fall in love with you for years." Garrett pulled back to look at him, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch. Then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. Two people who had wasted so much time on a feud that had never been theirs to fight. When they finally broke apart, Garrett was aware of the other men studiously looking away, giving them what privacy they could. She felt her cheeks heat, but she did not let go of Thomas's hand. The ride back to Bodie was slow, the men exhausted and several nursing injuries. Thomas rode beside Garrett, their horses so close their legs brushed occasionally. They did not speak much, but every time Garrett glanced over, Thomas was watching her with an expression that made her heart race. Dawn was breaking as they reached town, and people poured into the streets to greet them. Mrs. Sullivan embraced her sons with tears streaming down her face, and Garrett saw her own neighbor, old Mr. Peterson, nod approvingly when he noticed her and Thomas riding together. But not everyone was pleased. When Garrett dismounted in front of her store, Thomas's father was waiting. Jeremiah Sullivan was a big man, weathered by years of ranching, with eyes as hard as flint. "What is this I hear about you riding out with the rescue party?" he demanded, looking at Garrett with undisguised hostility. "What business does an Ellis have risking her neck for my son? She saved my life," Thomas said, stepping between them. "And I saved hers. The feud ends now, father." Jeremiah's face darkened. "You do not get to make that decision, boy. The Ellis family has been trying to destroy us for a decade." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You and Henry Ellis destroyed each other with stubbornness and pride. Garrett and I are not going to continue that. If you think I will allow you to associate with that woman, you are mistaken," Jeremiah said. Thomas straightened his shoulders. "I am 24 years old, father. I run half the ranch. I am not asking your permission." Father and son stared at each other, and Garrett saw the moment when Jeremiah realized he had lost this battle. The older man's jaw clenched, and he turned and walked away without another word. Garrett let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "That went well." Thomas laughed, though it sounded strained. "It could have been worse. He could have disowned me." "He still might," Garrett said quietly. "Then he does," Thomas replied. He took her hand, right there in the middle of Main Street with half the town watching. "I meant what I said in the canyon, Garrett. I am tired of pretending I do not care about you." Garrett squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from years of ranch work. "I am tired of it too." Over the next weeks, Bodie buzzed with gossip about Thomas Sullivan and Garrett Ellis. Some people were scandalized, others amused, but most were just relieved that the feud might finally be ending. The wolves did not return. The hunting party had killed 7 of them, including the alpha, and the rest had apparently moved on to easier hunting grounds. Life in the mining town began to return to normal, with one significant difference. Thomas came to Garrett's store nearly every day, sometimes with legitimate need for supplies, sometimes just to see her. They would talk for hours, discovering each other beyond the layers of assumed hatred. Garrett learned that Thomas had wanted to be a teacher when he was young, that he loved books and could recite poetry from memory. Thomas discovered that Garrett had a gift for numbers, and had taught herself accounting from her father's ledgers, that she dreamed of expanding the store into a full trading post. They also learned how similar they were. Both had been shaped by demanding fathers and the weight of family expectations. Both had sacrificed their own desires to maintain legacies they had not chosen. and both had been desperately lonely, surrounded by people but truly known by no one. One evening in early June, Thomas brought Garrett wildflowers he had picked in the high meadows above his ranch. They sat on the porch behind her store, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "My mother wants to meet you," Thomas said. "Properly, I mean. Not just passing in the street." Garrett felt her stomach flip. "Does she hate me too?" "She did," Thomas admitted. "But she has been watching us, and I think she is starting to understand that you make me happy. Happier than I have been in years." "I feel the same way," Garrett said softly. She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. "It is strange, is it not, how quickly everything changed?" "I do not think it changed quickly," Thomas said. "I think we just finally stopped fighting what was always there." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. Bodie's lights flickered on below them, and somewhere a piano played a cheerful tune. For the first time since her father died, Garrett felt at peace. Meeting Thomas's mother was every bit as awkward as Garrett had feared. Helen Sullivan was a small woman with steel-gray hair and her son's dark eyes, and she looked at Garrett with undisguised suspicion as they sat in the Sullivan Ranch house parlor. "My husband tells me you are trying to steal my son," Helen said bluntly. "Mother," Thomas protested, but Garrett held up a hand. "I am not trying to steal anyone, Mrs. Sullivan. Thomas makes his own choices. And he has chosen you despite everything our families have been through." "Because of everything our families have been through," Garrett corrected gently. "We are both tired of fighting. We want something different." Helen studied her for a long moment. "Your father was a hard man, unforgiving. So was yours," Garrett replied. "But neither of them are here anymore, and their grievances do not have to be ours." Something softened in Helen's expression. "You have spirit. I will give you that." She poured tea with precise movements. "Thomas tells me you run the general store by yourself. I have help, but yes, I manage it. That cannot be easy, a young woman alone in a town like Bodie." "It is not," Garrett admitted. "But it is what my father wanted, and it is what I want. The store is my legacy." Helen nodded slowly. "I can respect that. Building something, maintaining it, that takes strength." She paused, then added, "My husband will not accept this easily. He carries grudges like some men carry pocket watches." "I know," Garrett said, "but I hope in time he might see that Thomas and I together could be good for both families." "Perhaps," Helen said noncommittally. But when Garrett left an hour later, the older woman squeezed her hand briefly, and Garrett took it as a sign of hope. Jeremiah Sullivan proved more intractable. He refused to speak to Garrett when they crossed paths in town, and he made his displeasure with Thomas clear at every opportunity. Thomas bore it stoically, but Garrett could see the strain it put on him. "Maybe we should slow down," Garrett suggested one evening as they walked along Bodie's outskirts. "Give your father time to adjust." "No," Thomas said firmly. "I have spent my whole life doing what he wanted, being who he needed me to be. I am not giving up the first real happiness I have found because he is too stubborn to let go of the past." Garrett wanted to argue, but she understood. She had made similar choices, standing up to townspeople who thought she should sell the store, pushing back against expectations that she should be married and settled by now. They were both fighters, she realized, shaped by years of resistance. Maybe that was why they fit together so well. As summer deepened over Bodie, Garrett and Thomas became inseparable. They rode out together to the high country, where wildflowers carpeted the meadows and the air was thin and sweet. They had picnics by mountain streams and talked about everything and nothing. Thomas taught Garrett to read tracks, to identify different plants. Garrett introduced Thomas to her favorite books, reading aloud to him in the evenings while he whittled small animals from scraps of wood. They also began to plan for the future. Thomas had ideas about improving cattle breeding, introducing new bloodlines to make the herd hardier. Garrett wanted to expand her inventory, maybe even build a second store on the other side of town. Together, they talked about what they could accomplish if the Ellis and Sullivan resources were combined rather than competing. But it was not all peaceful. One night in July, someone threw rocks through the store's front window, and nasty words were painted on the door. Thomas was furious, ready to hunt down whoever had done it, but Garrett stopped him. "It could be anyone," she said, surveying the damage. "Someone who lost money betting on our families destroying each other, or someone who just hates change." "I do not care who it was," Thomas said. "They damaged your property and threatened you. And if you go charging around town accusing people, it will only make things worse." Garrett touched his face gently. "I appreciate that you want to protect me, but I can handle broken windows and hateful words. I have been handling them for years." Thomas pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I hate that you have to." "Then help me fix the window," Garrett said, "and tomorrow we will open the store like nothing happened." They worked through the night, boarding up the broken window temporarily and scrubbing the paint from the door. By morning, when Bodie woke up, the general store was open for business, and Thomas Sullivan was standing behind the counter with Garrett Ellis, making change and wrapping parcels like it was the most natural thing in the world. The statement was not lost on the town. Gradually, cautiously, people began to accept the new reality. Some of the Sullivan Ranch hands started shopping at Garrett's store instead of riding all the way to Aurora for supplies. Some of Garrett's regular customers stopped avoiding the Sullivans at social gatherings. The walls that had divided the families for a decade began, slowly, to crumble. In August, Thomas asked Garrett to marry him. They were sitting by a creek in the hills, their horses grazing nearby, when he pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "On my mother's side. She would have liked you, I think. She was tough and stubborn and did not suffer fools." Garrett laughed, taking the ring and holding it up to catch the sunlight. "Sounds like we would have gotten along. So, is that a yes?" Thomas asked, and there was vulnerability in his voice that made Garrett's heart ache. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas kissed her then, long and deep, and Garrett felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas traced her jaw with his thumb. "I love you," he said. "I should have told you sooner, but I love you, Garrett Ellis." "I love you too," Garrett whispered, "even though you are a Sullivan and I am supposed to hate you." "Especially because I am a Sullivan," Thomas corrected with a grin. "We do not do anything the easy way." They set the wedding for September, giving them time to plan and, Garrett hoped, time for the last resistance to crumble. Helen Sullivan surprised everyone by offering to host the ceremony at the ranch, in the garden she had spent 15 years cultivating. Garrett accepted gratefully, touched by the gesture. The only dark cloud was Jeremiah Sullivan's continued refusal to acknowledge the engagement. He had moved out of the main ranch house and into the foreman's cabin, claiming he could not bear to watch his son make such a mistake. It hurt Thomas deeply, though he tried to hide it, and Garrett felt helpless to ease that particular pain. 2 weeks before the wedding, Jeremiah showed up at Garrett's store. It was late afternoon and she was alone, why having left for the day. The old rancher stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking older and more tired than Garrett had ever seen him. "Mr. Sullivan," Garrett said cautiously, "what can I do for you?" "I owe you an apology," Jeremiah said, the words clearly difficult for him. "And an explanation, though you have no reason to hear me out." Garrett gestured to a chair and Jeremiah sat heavily. For a long moment, he was silent, turning his hat in his hands. "Your father and I were friends once," he said finally. "Best friends, actually. We came to Bodie together back in '63 when it was barely a camp. We worked claims side by side, saved each other's lives more than once. When we finally struck it rich, we agreed to split everything 50-50. I would start a ranch, he would open a store, and we would build this town together." Garrett had never heard this story. Her father had never spoken of being friends with the Sullivans, only enemies. What happened? She asked quietly. "I fell in love with the woman he wanted to marry," Jeremiah said. "Helen. She was visiting from Sacramento, and both your father and I courted her. She chose me, and Henry never forgave it. He said I betrayed him, that we had an agreement to not compete over everything, including women. I said love did not work that way. We both said things we could not take back." Jeremiah's voice was rough with old pain. "The partnership dissolved. Henry opened his store where we had agreed to build together, right on the land I needed for water access. He did it out of spite, pure and simple. I tried to fight him legally, but he had the documents and I did not. So I fought back the only way I knew how, bad-mouthing him around town, trying to drive customers away. It spiraled from there." "Why are you telling me this now?" Garrett asked. "Because I see the way Thomas looks at you, and it is the same way I looked at Helen 40 years ago. And I realize that if I had been in his position, if Helen's family had forbidden us from being together, I would have fought them too." Jeremiah met her eyes. "I have been a stubborn fool, Garrett. I let my pride and my hurt destroy the best friendship I ever had, and I have been taking it out on you and your father ever since. But I will not let it destroy my relationship with my son." Garrett felt tears prick her eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate you telling me this. But it is Thomas you need to talk to." "I know," Jeremiah said, standing, "but I wanted you to understand first. You are going to be my daughter-in-law, and I want to start fresh with you if you will let me." Garrett stood and extended her hand. Jeremiah shook it, his grip firm and warm. "I would like that," she said. That evening Thomas came to her store with a stunned expression. "My father apologized," he said without preamble. "He actually apologized and asked if he could give us his blessing." Garrett smiled. "He came to see me too. I think he is finally ready to let go of the past." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I cannot believe this is real sometimes. A few months ago, we could barely stand to be in the same room, and now I cannot imagine my life without you." "It was always real," Garrett said. "We just needed wolves to make us see it." The wedding was beautiful. The Sullivan Ranch garden was in full bloom, with roses and honeysuckle filling the air with sweetness. Half of Bodie turned out for the ceremony, curious and celebratory in equal measure. Garrett wore a simple white dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit. Thomas wore a new black suit that made him look impossibly handsome. Y stood up as Garrett's witness, having become a close friend over the years. Daniel, Thomas's brother, stood up for him. And when the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was profound and meaningful. Jeremiah Sullivan walked Garrett down the makeshift aisle, since her own father was gone. It was a gesture that meant more than words could express, a visible symbol of reconciliation. Helen wept throughout the ceremony, though whether from joy or sadness or relief, Garrett could not tell. When Thomas kissed his bride, the assembled crowd cheered. The celebration that followed lasted long into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Garrett danced with her new husband under the stars, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely, unreservedly happy. They spent their wedding night in a small cabin Thomas had built in the high meadows, a place he had been working on in secret for months. It was simple but beautiful, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows that looked out over the valley. "I thought we could come here whenever we needed to get away," Thomas said, watching Garrett explore the single room. "A place that is just ours, not the Sullivan Ranch or the Ellis store, just us." Garrett turned to him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It is perfect." Thomas crossed the room and took her in his arms. "You are perfect," he said, and then he was kissing her, and Garrett stopped thinking altogether. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's hearts. Thomas was patient and attentive, and Garrett felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed Thomas had built himself, watching firelight flicker across the ceiling. "I never thought I could be this happy," Garrett whispered. "Neither did I," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay this happy." Garrett smiled and burrowed closer to her husband's warmth. And outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the last traces of old hurts and older feuds. Married life suited them both. Garrett continued to run the general store, but now Thomas was a true partner in the business, helping with heavy lifting and deliveries, offering suggestions on inventory. In turn, Garrett began spending time at the Sullivan Ranch, learning about cattle management and range rotation. They discovered they worked well together, their different strengths complementing each other. Within months, they had merged many of the Ellis and Sullivan business interests. The store began carrying more Sullivan beef and leather goods, while the ranch started using Ellis credit lines to purchase equipment. What had been two competing enterprises became a partnership that benefited both families. Not everyone was happy about the changes. A few of the old-timers grumbled about tradition being lost, and some of the Sullivan Ranch hands resented taking orders from a woman, even indirectly. But Thomas made it clear that Garrett was his equal partner in all things, and gradually, most people accepted the new reality. Garrett also worked to mend fences with the rest of the Sullivan family. Helen became not just a mother-in-law but a friend, teaching Garrett family recipes and sharing stories about Thomas's childhood. Daniel, Thomas's younger brother, started courting a girl from town, and Garrett helped him pick out a ring when he was ready to propose. Even Jeremiah softened over time. He and Garrett would never be close, but they developed a mutual respect. He admitted, grudgingly, that her head for business had helped the ranch more than he wanted to acknowledge, and she came to appreciate his deep knowledge of the land and animals. The following spring, Garrett realized she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply. Thomas went very still, then turned to look at her with wonder in his eyes. "Truly, truly," Garrett confirmed. "Probably arrive in October, if I am calculating correctly." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. Then he knelt and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there," he said solemnly. "I am your father, and I already love you more than anything." Garrett ran her fingers through his hair, feeling tears of happiness on her cheeks. A year ago, she had been alone, bitter, clinging to a feud she barely understood. Now she had a husband she adored, a family that accepted her, and a child on the way. The transformation was almost too much to comprehend. The pregnancy was not easy. Garrett suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and the high altitude of Bodie made her breathless and tired. But Thomas was patient and attentive, bringing her ginger tea and rubbing her aching back, reading to her when she was too exhausted to do anything else. Helen was a constant presence as well, offering advice and reassurance. "Babies are resilient," she said when Garrett worried about every little pain. "And you are strong. You will be fine." In late October, on a cold night when snow already dusted the mountains, Garrett went into labor. It was long and painful, and there were moments when she was certain she would not survive it. But Thomas held her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement, and finally, just before dawn, their son was born. He was small and red-faced and screaming, absolutely perfect. Thomas held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Garrett felt a love so fierce it was almost frightening. "What should we name him?" Thomas asked, not taking his eyes off his son. Garrett thought about the men who had shaped their lives, the fathers who had loved them and hurt them and left them with legacies to untangle. "Henry," she said, "after my father, and James after yours." Thomas looked at her in surprise. Jeremiah's full name was Jeremiah James Sullivan. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure," Garrett said. "Our son should carry both our histories, the good and the bad. He should know where he came from so he can choose where he is going." Thomas kissed her, gentle and reverent. "Henry James Sullivan. It is a strong name for a strong boy." Little Henry was indeed strong, despite his small size. He nursed well and grew quickly, filling the Sullivan ranch house with noise and life. Garrett moved between the ranch and the store, managing both her business and new motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything. Thomas was a devoted father, constantly holding and playing with his son. Garrett would often find them together in the evening, Thomas reading aloud from whatever book was at hand while Henry stared up at him with solemn eyes. "You think he understands?" Garrett asked one night watching them. "Not the words," Thomas said, "but he knows my voice and he knows he is loved. That is enough for now." As Henry grew into a toddler, Garrett and Thomas's business ventures continued to expand. They opened a second store in Aurora, the next town over, and began buying cattle from smaller ranches to add to their herd. The name Sullivan Ellis became synonymous with fair dealing and quality goods throughout Mono County. They also gave back to the community that had watched them grow. They funded a school in Bodie, hiring a proper teacher and providing books. They helped struggling miners when claims ran dry, offering credit and sometimes jobs on the ranch. The people who had once watched their feud with morbid fascination now watched their partnership with respect and admiration. When Henry was 3, Garrett became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, though she still tired quickly. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Grace, was born on a warm summer evening with far less drama than her brother's arrival. Sarah had Garrett's green eyes and Thomas's dark hair, and from the moment she could crawl, she was fearless. She followed her older brother everywhere, determined to keep up despite being 2 years younger. Garrett watched them play together and felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Thomas asked one evening as they watched their children chase fireflies in the twilight. "If the wolves had never come, if we had never been forced to work together all the time," Garrett admitted. "I think we would have wasted our whole lives hating each other, never knowing what we were missing." "I am grateful for those wolves," Thomas said. "Strange as that sounds." Garrett leaned against her husband's shoulder. "So am I. They saved us from ourselves." The years passed in a gentle rhythm of seasons and growth. Henry grew into a serious, studious boy who loved books as much as horses. Sarah was wild and joyful, fearless in a way that terrified and delighted Garrett in equal measure. They added 2 more children to the family, twin boys named Michael and Peter, who arrived when Garrett was 30 and promptly turned the household upside down with their energy and mischief. The Sullivan Ellis ranch and store continued to prosper. Thomas proved to have a gift for innovation. introducing new agricultural techniques and expanding into mining interests. Garrett's business acumen kept them profitable even during economic downturns. Together, they built something larger and more lasting than either of their fathers had managed alone. Jeremiah lived to see all 4 of his grandchildren, and before he died peacefully in his sleep at 78, he told Garrett that she had been the best thing to happen to the Sullivan family in generations. Helen lived even longer, becoming a beloved grandmother who spoiled the children shamelessly and told them stories about the early days of Bodie. Bodie itself changed over the years. The mines began to play out, and people drifted away to new strikes in Nevada and Idaho. The population that had once numbered 10,000 shrank to a few hundred hardy souls. But the Sullivan-Ellis family remained, anchoring the community, providing employment and stability when everything else was uncertain. Garrett watched her children grow with pride and occasional melancholy. Henry went east to college, then returned to take over management of the ranch. Sarah married a lawyer from Sacramento and moved to the city, though she visited often with her own children. The twins, inseparable as always, went into business together, opening a bank in Reno that financed mining operations throughout Nevada. Through it all, Garrett and Thomas remained partners in every sense of the word. They still rode up to their cabin in the high meadows when they needed to escape, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They argued sometimes, passionate disagreements about business or child rearing, but they always reconciled, always remembered what mattered. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Garrett by taking her back to the canyon where they had fought the wolves together. It was a difficult ride for both of them, now in their late 40s, but Garrett understood why it was important. They stood in the clearing where their lives had changed, where hatred had transformed into something precious. The canyon was peaceful now, wildflowers growing in the spaces between rocks, no trace of the violence that had occurred there. "I wanted to come back here," Thomas said, "to remember how it started, how lucky we were to find each other, even in the midst of so much anger and fear." Garrett took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that had supported her through 25 years. "We were not lucky," she said. "We were stubborn enough to change, to choose love over hate. That is not luck, that is courage." "Then we were both very brave," Thomas said with a smile. He pulled her close and kissed her, and Garrett felt the same flutter in her chest she had felt on their wedding night, the same certainty that this was right, that they were right together. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Garrett thought about the girl she had been, angry and alone, clinging to a feud she had not started and did not understand. She thought about Thomas, equally trapped by expectation and history. And she thought about the wolves, those fierce creatures that had forced them to see each other clearly for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered into the gathering darkness. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For being brave enough to love me," Garrett said. "For fighting beside me and for me, and sometimes against me when I needed it. For giving me a family and a future I never thought I could have." Thomas held her tighter. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every argument, every hardship, every moment of doubt. Because all of it led here, to us, to this." They rode back to Bodie as the stars emerged overhead, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built a love that would outlast the town itself, the mines, the very mountains. They had started as enemies and become partners, had hated and then loved with equal intensity. And in the years that followed, when their grandchildren asked how they met, Garrett and Thomas would smile at each other and say simply, "The wolves brought us together." The children would beg for the full story, and they would tell it, about the pack that descended on Bodie, about fighting side by side, about choosing love over legacy. But what they could never quite put into words was how it felt, that first moment of recognition when hatred crumbled and revealed what had always been underneath. How it felt to look at someone you thought you knew and realize you had been blind. How it felt to be saved not from danger but from yourself, from a life half lived and a heart half closed. The wolves had been the catalyst, but the choice had been theirs. To lower their weapons and open their hearts, to be vulnerable when everything in their history told them to be defensive. To believe that love could be stronger than hate, that two people could rewrite the stories they had inherited and create something new. Garrett Ellis, Sullivan lived to be 76 years old. In all those years, through all the changes and challenges, she never regretted choosing Thomas, never doubted the path they had walked together. When she died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Thomas held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for being brave enough to love me too." Thomas followed her 6 months later, unable to bear a world without his partner, his love, his Garrett. They were buried together in the Bodie cemetery, overlooking the town they had helped build, the land they had fought for and loved on. Their headstone was simple: Thomas Sullivan and Garrett Ellis Sullivan, together against all odds. The store and ranch passed to their children and grandchildren, who continued the Sullivan-Ellis tradition of fair dealing and community service. The story of how Garrett and Thomas fell in love became family legend, told and retold until it took on an almost mythic quality. But for those who had been there, who had seen the hatred transform into love, who had watched two stubborn people choose courage over comfort, the story needed no embellishment. It was powerful enough on its own. A tale of redemption and forgiveness, of finding love in the last place you expected, of wolves that saved instead of destroyed. And sometimes, on quiet nights in Bodie, when the wind whistled through the abandoned buildings and the moon hung low over the mountains, people swore they could hear wolves howling in the distance. Not threatening, but almost grateful, as if the pack knew what they had set in motion all those years ago. Two lives changed and joined, two families united, two hearts finally, fully whole. The years continued to march forward even after Garrett and Thomas were gone, but their legacy lived on not just in business ventures or property holdings, but in the very fabric of how their descendants understood love. Their great-granddaughter, teaching her own daughter to ride on the same land where wolves once prowled, would tell the story differently than the history books recorded it. They could have stayed enemies, she would say, watching her daughter's small hands grip the saddle horn. It would have been easier, expected even, but they chose something harder and infinitely better. They chose to see each other as human beings instead of symbols of old hurts, and that made all the difference. The Sullivan-Ellis Ranch eventually became a historical site, preserved as an example of California's ranching heritage. The general store was converted into a museum, its shelves still stocked with period-appropriate goods, a testament to Garrett's business acumen and vision. Tourists would walk through and marvel at how one woman had managed such a successful enterprise in an era when women were supposed to be decorative and domestic. But the guides who knew the full story would smile and say, "Garrett Ellis Sullivan was never supposed to be anything. She just was who she was, and she was extraordinary." The cabin in the high meadows, that private sanctuary Thomas had built for his bride, remained in the family for generations. Each Sullivan-Ellis descendant, upon reaching adulthood, was given a key and told they could use it whenever the world became too much. Many proposals happened there. Many important decisions were made in that simple room with its stone fireplace and glass windows. The wolves, those magnificent creatures that had catalyzed such profound change, passed into legend. Wildlife biologists in later years would study the records from 1878 and speculate about what drove such a large pack down from the mountains. Some theorized about food scarcity, others about disease in their natural prey population. None could fully explain the coordinated attack on a human settlement, the almost unnatural intelligence the pack had displayed. But the people of Bodie, the ones who had lived through it, had their own theories. They said the wolves were sent, though by what or whom they could not say. Sent to shake the town out of its complacency, to force old enemies into new alliances, to prove that survival and love both required putting aside pride. The wolves knew, old-timers would say, sitting in what remained of the saloon where Garrett and Thomas had once faced each other as adversaries. They knew what we all needed, even if we did not. As Bodie declined and eventually became a ghost town, preserved but no longer truly alive, the story of Thomas and Garrett took on new resonance. It became a parable about adaptability and change, about letting go of the past to embrace the future. School children from all over California visited on field trips and learned about the feud, and the wolves and the love that conquered both. Some of them, particularly the young girls, would stand in front of the museum display showing Garrett's ledgers and accounts, her careful handwriting still legible after more than a century, and feel something shift inside them. If a woman in 1878 could defy expectations, could run a business and fight wolves and choose her own destiny, what could they do in their own time? The boys, meanwhile, would study the pictures of Thomas, his serious face and steady eyes, and learn that strength could mean putting down your weapon instead of picking it up, that courage could look like forgiveness instead of revenge. But perhaps the most important lesson, the one that transcended gender and time and circumstance, was simply this: that love, real love, requires risk. It requires vulnerability. It requires being willing to see the person in front of you clearly, without the filter of assumption and prejudice. Garrett and Thomas had spent years not seeing each other, blinded by family expectations and inherited hate. It took a crisis to strip away those blinders, to force them to see each other as they truly were. But once they did, once they took that leap of faith, they never looked back. In the modern era, when the Sullivan Ellis descendants gathered for reunions, they would toast to Thomas and Garrett, to the wolves, to the improbable and beautiful love story that had given all of them life. They would tell the story again, passing it down to another generation, making sure it was never forgotten, because some stories, the best ones, the truest ones, deserve to be remembered. Not because they are simple or easy, but because they show what is possible when we choose courage over comfort, love over hate, hope over despair. Thomas Sullivan and Garrett Ellis Sullivan chose all of those things, and in doing so, they transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who came after them. The wolves brought them together, but they did the rest themselves, building a partnership and a love that proved stronger than any feud, any obstacle, any challenge. Their story did not end with their deaths. It continued in every Sullivan Ellis child who learned to see past surface differences, in every business venture that prioritized fairness over profit, in every act of forgiveness and reconciliation that their descendants committed. The ripples of one night in April 1878, when wolves descended on Bodie and two enemies fought side by side, spread outward across generations. And if love can truly be measured, it is not in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in those ripples, in the lives touched and changed and made better by two people who were brave enough to put down their weapons and open their hearts, who looked past hate and found something infinitely more powerful waiting underneath. That is the legacy of Thomas and Garrett Sullivan. Not wealth or property or even the businesses they built together, but the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love when hate would have been easier, of seeing the person instead of the enemy, of building a future together instead of fighting over the past. And somewhere in the mountains above what remains of Bodie, if you are quiet and patient and very lucky, you might still hear wolves howling in the night. Their descendants, perhaps, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. But those who know the story, who understand what those wolves represent, will smile and whisper a quiet thank you to the creatures that brought two stubborn, proud, hurting people together and gave them the chance to become something more. Because that is what love does. It transforms us. It makes us braver, kinder, more fully ourselves. Thomas and Garrett learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but once learned, they never forgot it. They lived it every day for over 50 years, through good times and bad, through triumph and tragedy, always together, always partners, always choosing each other over and over again. That is a love worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth passing down through the generations as proof that no matter how deep the hatred, how old the wounds, love can still win. It just takes courage and wolves, and two people willing to take the first, terrifying step toward each other across a divide that once seemed insurmountable. Thomas and Garrett took that step, and in doing so, they changed everything.